Hi, welcome to this lecture pod, which is an introduction to digital research. I'm Dr. Jenna Condie. I'm a senior lecturer in digital society at Western Sydney University. I acknowledge that I am recording and making this lecture about digital research on Gundungurra and Darug lands and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that higher education curriculum really must challenge the status quo by centering Indigenous ways of knowing and doing research. After listening to this lecture pod, you will be able to explain what digital research is, why it matters, and provide some examples, and identify a number of key considerations that researchers take into account when doing their digital research. Let's start with what is digital research. According to Professor Annette Markham, digital research is a very broad domain, and what constitutes digital research should not be defined by a particular perspective, method, tool, or unit of analysis, but by the degree to which the digital is centrally relevant in the phenomenon, context, or focus of analysis. In other words, is the research project and the questions being asked within it digital enough? Similarly, with my colleague Dr. Christina Costa, we argued that digital research examines digital phenomena in ways that enable the development of digital research methods that go beyond the use of the web as a repository of data or a space where researchers tend to apply traditional forms of data collection. The key message here is that while traditional ways of doing research have indeed been digitalized, for example, doing a survey online, carrying out a Zoom interview, or recruiting participants through social media platforms. Digital research is really about digital life and the systems and social processes made possible by digital technologies. In turn, digital research creates new methods and new ways of doing research that are distinctly digital in form. It helps to look at some examples of digital research. Here's one from Professor Markham's work. Here's an example of three researchers taking different approaches to the study of hate speech. So, researcher one conducts face to face interviews with journalists who have experienced hate speech online. Researcher two takes a different approach and analyzes Twitter datasets to visualize and search for patterns in social media content about hate speech and how it flows across social networks. Whereas researcher three explores how members define and frame hate speech in extremist Reddit communities. It is worth mentioning here that there are potentially infinite number of ways to study hate speech, but these three examples cut across the key trends in the current landscape of digital research. Here's another example, this time from my own work, looking at women's use of dating apps and their safety concerns. So researcher one conducts text-based interviews with women, asking them about their safety concerns and practices when using dating apps to meet and date men. Researcher two analyzes the dating apps themselves, looking at their user interfaces, using a walkthrough method to identify the safe and unsafe design practices, and also compare apps with one another. Researcher three takes a different approach again, carrying out a digital ethnography of their dating app use to identify safety practices and concerns as they occur in situ in everyday life. Again, there are potentially infinite number of ways to research dating apps and safety concerns, but the three examples here capture likely approaches that digital researchers might take to generate new knowledge around this digital phenomenon. The processes of research are really being upended by the digital. All aspects of our work are being reworked. So it can now just take a few clicks or downloads, sign-ups or swipes to unlock new research spaces that enable a deep engagement with the digital world. Whereas prior, getting into the research field could have taken lots of time in terms of travel and perhaps negotiations with community gatekeepers. The research field can now be an app on your phone that's in your hand and in your home and everywhere else that you go. And in turn, the rules of research really do need rewriting. As Rupert Law and Savage point out, social research practices need to be reassembled. We also need ways of thinking that capture the complexities of who we are becoming with digital technologies. How do we center the human experiences of digital technologies, but also acknowledge that the agency of technology design and infrastructures are making a real difference in the phenomena that we are seeking to understand? The digital also represents an opportunity to upend some of the long-standing and troubling power relationships within research. Dr. Irinma Oku calls for digital research methods that support people from marginalised and oppressed groups to generate knowledge and carry out research that matters to them. Her work looks at citizen science practices and how communities can become more involved in research and become citizen researchers themselves with digital technologies. Given the increasing complexity and inseparability of the digital from our lives, we need conceptual frameworks or lenses, which are ways of understanding digital phenomena that enable us to interrogate our assumptions on questions such as: what does a social media post even mean? What counts as truth? Who matters here in this research? What does a person's data tell you about them or a particular issue or context? And what doesn't it tell you? Let's take the phenomenon of selfies as our example. What do selfies mean to you and to others? Do they represent the selfie taker, or are they part of the selfie taker's sense of being human? How do you, as a researcher, engage in selfie taking practices? Why are you even interested in selfie taking? What makes a good selfie? Is it one that makes it onto the platform, or one that is shared more personally and intimately? Who gets to take a selfie? Does anyone get shamed for taking them? How are selfies reproducing social structures of gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class, for example? The conceptual framework you develop for your digital research shapes the kind of research questions you can ask. Something to consider when you are designing a research project is whether you are challenging or maintaining the status quo with your research questions. What conceptual tools do you need to think differently with about digital technologies and digital phenomenon? Professor Bronwyn Carlson and Dr. Ryan Fraser have stated the need for new theoretical interventions that account for the context, difference, and complexity of digital phenomena. Their research focuses on cyberbullying and how the cyberbullying field tends to apply theoretical frameworks that do not take into account the specific dynamics and contexts of cyberbullying and the very different experiences of people from groups that are minoritized and marginalized within society. Their research focuses on Indigenous peoples' experiences of cyberbullying, emphasising the importance of the cultural context of use and how Indigenous social media is shaped by connection and care. Cyberbullying is happening in distinct social and cultural contexts. Carlson and Fraser emphasise that the colonial, white settler political context is imperative to understanding Indigenous peoples' experiences of cyberbullying and how that cyberbullying functions to maintain unequal and unjust systems of oppression. How you think about and interpret digital phenomena, the theory of your digital research, remains a very important consideration. I say theory remains an important consideration, as one thing that characterises and differentiates digital research today is new data and the vast and voluminous amounts of data, known as big data, that researchers are now working with to make inferences about social life and digital society. Every day, people across the globe produce data about themselves and the ways that they live through digital technologies. Sometimes this data is deliberately made, such as when we upload content to social networking sites, for example, and other times this data is automatically generated, such as when we use our rail cards or when we use search engines to find information. As Purdom and Elliott note, the opportunities for social scientists and policymakers, as well as a heap of other people, is that citizens are deliberately or consequentially creating their own digital archives. Never before have we created so much data about ourselves, which means that there are many new possibilities for research, but also a number of new exploitations. Big data is increasingly a prominent option across many sectors as a way to know about social phenomena. It has long been understood and explained with three V's. Those are volume, velocity, and variety. Volume simply refers to the enormous quantities of data available. Velocity refers to how data is created in real time constantly, and variety refers to the vast array of data sets that take different forms that can now be gathered through digital devices and software. The three V's of big data have been extended over the years to acknowledge the ever increasing complexity of digital data. Some more V's have been added, such as value. So that refers to the opportunities offered by big data to generate new insights. the veracity or validity of big data, so the accuracy or truthfulness of it, and the virality, the speed at which big data can be circulated online. For Professor Deborah Lupton, big data is better characterized as 13 Ps. I won't go through all of them because you can look them up further through the references list at the end of this presentation. The Ps that I would like to draw your attention to here the personal nature of big data. This is to emphasize that while our data points might be among those of many other people, it is still very personal. As our lives are digitally enmeshed, researchers might be accessing very intimate data that can tell them a lot about us, even if those data points aren't connected up. And when they are connected up, they do reveal much about a person's life. The other P I'd like to mention is partial, to acknowledge how big data can only ever tell a certain narrative or only ever partially know about the way that we live our lives. It tells a particular story, and it's important that people delve deeper and access other forms of data and ways of knowing to go alongside it. There's also privacy as well. There are growing concerns about privacy and the security of our data and who's getting access to it and who's using it. Can it be used for surveillance or marketing purposes? Might it be hacked? Is it vulnerable? This is a really key concern. And the final P I'd like to talk about here is the playfulness of big data, and to really emphasize that creativity is involved in a lot of digital research, especially in relation to big data and how we might visualize it and share it with others so that they can understand what big data is and what it can tell us about social life. The possible draw to big data is in its power. Lots of scholars are pointing out that big data is problematic as it represents capital. It is worth something. In turn, people are being dispossessed of their personal data in the current system of data as capital. O'Connell stresses that even with the removal of personal information and de-identification practices in place, people are turned into a set of categories within data analysis, and these categories can strip their autonomy away and propagate inappropriate and sometimes harmful views about people and communities that are oversimplified and decontextualized. Another perspective problem is that big data approaches are often more data driven, in that the data exists, it is there, so researchers start there with their analysis. Rather than starting at the conceptual level, considering what this data means and what the context of its existence is. Given these problems with the way that our data is being captured and used, we also need new ethical practices that take into account the complexities of doing digital research. Even though there is lots of data out there, just because we can access that data doesn't necessarily mean that we can and should use it for research purposes. When people post online, they don't necessarily do that with researchers in mind, even if it is technically posting in a public domain. O'Connell calls us to resist that dispossessing people of their data within our own research practices. It's very tempting to go and rush to research the trending rather than take a step back and go at a slower pace to be more ethical in your practice. One of the ways that researchers are taking a more ethical approach is by reaching out to people who have generated data that is available online and of interest to their research. UK researcher Dr. Cathy sought informed consent from women living with and beyond breast cancer to use their blog entries about their experiences as data. It was particularly important to centre ethics in her project, given the very personal, sensitive, and emotional experiences of cancer. In the end, Dr. Er's approach to seeking informed consent, rather than simply using the blogs as they were in the public domain, resulted in just one person agreeing to be a participant. And do you know what? That was enough for a really good ethical digital research project that generated new knowledge about the lived experiences of breast cancer. It might be very tempting to enter into spaces on digital platforms to research the communities you are interested in, but it's important to think about the ethical implications of all of your digital actions. If you do not belong to the community you are researching, is it ethical to enter and access their digital spaces? Probably not. A key ethical practice then is for all researchers, not just those in the digital realm, is to acknowledge who they are in relation to the people they are researching or researching with in their studies. Your digital identities matter. So, are you an insider to the research, part of the community you are studying, or are you an outsider, or are you both? Let's blur those boundaries. As soon as you put on that research hat and step into the role of a digital researcher, your identity position shifts to the outside of a community within which you might have previously been an insider. These positionalities matter, and you need to reflect on them as part of your ethical practices. Being in digital spaces can sometimes make these practices trickier because one click and then you are into a space, which is often quite different from going to a place and entering, say, through a community building, for example. Digital technologies create new subjectivities for researchers. For example, if you're researching something like dating apps, it's important to explore the apps to get a deeper perspective on them. It is surprising how many people are researching things that they haven't used themselves. They definitely have a very outsider position then in relation to their research. As soon as you start swiping, for example, into dating apps, you're swiping yourself into the field. You are entering a new subjectivity, which is something you should try and acknowledge and take responsibility for, especially where platform designs require you to interact with other users who are there for reasons far different to yours. Those people are not expecting encounters with researchers. Platform architectures and designs are also very personalized, and we now have devices and systems that determine what we see based on who we are. This is another reason to explore your own digital identities in relation to your research. Algorithms shape what the researcher sees as they interrogate digital technologies, and that view is therefore always partial. We need to be cautious and careful not to make big claims that are overgeneralized based on what we've found in our digital research adventures. Another researcher using a device with another set of algorithms in play would get a very different story. Reflexivity is a key practice for going deeper with your understandings of yourself in the research and how who you are shapes the research that you do. We need to acknowledge ourselves as researchers shaping the processes of research in order to take responsibility for the research stories we tell. Research is powerful. Research findings can impact communities, and it is important that the people doing the research have the best interests of the research communities at front and centre in their digital research practices. In conclusion, this lecture pod introduced you to digital research and some of the key considerations, as well as opportunities and challenges facing digital researchers right now. There is a lot more to digital research, and I encourage you to explore some of the literature I have drawn upon in this lecture pod. Here are the references. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or suggestions, please reach out. I would love to hear from you.